As the Soviets continued to evacuate the city of Stalingrad, one man managed to get permission to enter the city. A terrifying crossing, fear. The ferry is full of vehicles, carts, hundreds of people crowded together, and it gets stuck. A Ju-88 drops a bomb from high above, a huge spout of water, upright bluish-white in colour. The feeling of fear. There isn't a single machine gun at the crossing, not a single little anti-aircraft gun. Messers are howling over the Volga. There is a haze and smoke over it. Smoke canisters are burned constantly to camouflage the crossing. They made it across and found the city was a burned dead wreckage filled with smoke, chaos and confusion. Yet, despite the destruction and desperation, there were still small signs of life within it. The crew of the ferry are eating juicy watermelon slices, looking into the sky now and then. A boy is looking attentively at the float of his fishing angle, dangling his feet outside. An elderly woman is sitting on a little bench knitting a stocking. We entered a destroyed house. The inhabitants of the building were having dinner, sitting at tables made of planks of wood and boxes. Children were blowing at hot shi in their bowls. It was clear that the city needed a miracle, and that miracle, it was hoped, would be the offensive that Stalin had demanded to the north of the city. Zhukov, of course, had little choice but to comply with the dictator's wishes. So, overnight, from the 4th to 5th of September 1942, Zhukov ordered Malinovsky, Kozlov and Kryachunkin to launch their attack at 0900 hours on the 5th of September, joining Moskalenka's forces, who would attack at 0630 hours. And they were to do this whether their forces were ready or not, which of course they were not. Moskalenka's army had already lost half of its original 300 tanks, yet dutifully attacked at 0630 hours. Malinovsky's 66th Army did join in at 0900 hours, but not all of its forces were ready, so they went in piecemeal. And, having not yet had time to prepare, Kozlov's 24th and Kryachunkin's 4th Tank armies were late and only attacked at 1500 hours. So yes, the offensive went in haphazardly and didn't have the punch needed to break through the German front, let alone encircle the enemy, which was the ultimate objective. Artillery and Katyushas opened up, but their volleys weren't dense enough to do much damage to the German side, and so the infantry units involved in the attack barely moved out of their trenches before being cut down by substantial enemy fire. Some have described these attacks as human wave assaults, but by the sounds of it, they didn't even get a chance to develop into that because they were mown down before this. Large numbers of T-34s and American M3 Lend-Lease tanks were involved in these attacks, but the M3 tanks were poorly armoured and dealt with in the usual manner. The companies of Panzer Abteilung 103 were committed independently, being rushed from one fire to another. The German defensive strategy of repulsing infantry attacks and allowing Soviet tanks to push through the line when the pressure became unbearable worked. Soviet tank crews rigidly focused on obtaining distant objectives rather than cooperating with their infantry and eliminating German resistance nests. Once isolated from their supporting infantry, the tanks became easy picking for the determined and expertly led panzer companies. As a result, none of these attacks really achieved anything of note. Interestingly, 103rd Panzer Battalion only lost one tank in this period, although some more were damaged. 3rd Motorized Division, which took the brunt of the attack, suffered 68 men killed, 179 wounded, and 5 men missing. Stukas were diverted from supporting the attack on Stalingrad to help stop Zhukov's attack, but otherwise there wasn't much of an impact. It's unclear what the Soviet losses were on this first day, but they were a lot, and Zhukov's entire offensive had stalled. Stalin rang him that evening. "How are things going?" Zhukov explained that the attack had failed to do much of anything except for draw some German units away from the attack on the city. This was true as the 545th Infantry Regiment of the 389th Infantry Division relieved 2 battalions of the 92nd Infantry Regiment of the 60th Motorized Division. These were now moved north to reinforce the defences against Zhukov's attack. Stalin responded, Keep up your attacks. The main objective is to divert as many enemy forces as possible from Stalingrad. Driven by Stalin's long shadow, Zhukov had no choice but to keep the attacks going in the hope that it would slow Paulus's advance. And despite the losses, the stalled Soviet attack was having an effect on the outcome of the fighting in Stalingrad, as you're about to see. Wietersheim's corps was not only suffering from losses of men and material, but was also lacking in ammunition. Wietersheim therefore told Paulus that his front was strained to the limit and that he needed more reinforcements and more support. He even suggested delaying the attack on Stalingrad until after the northern flank was secure. Paulus disagreed, saying the priority was the capture of Stalingrad, and once it fell, they could reinforce the north. Yet Paulus did decide to reinforce Wietersheim. In the middle of the front, the 3 infantry divisions of Seilitz's 51st Army Corps attacked westwards, making only small gains against stubborn Soviet opposition. The 112th Rifle Division, the one with around 285 men left, continued to fight near Gumrak Station, along with the 11 remaining T-60 light tanks of the 27th Tank Brigade. The 295th Infantry Division fought with them, as the 71st Infantry Division battled the 131st Rifle Division. But the 71st Infantry was then counterattacked by 2 rifle divisions. The 87th Rifle Division, which, probably with the 20 tanks of 99th Tank Brigade in support, managed to retake part of Opatnaya railway station. And Afanaseyev's 244th Rifle Division, which threw itself at the 191st Infantry Regiment. According to Glantz, Lopatin mistakenly thought that the 244th had wiped out the German regiment, but this turned out to be a mistaken belief. Still, 71st Infantry Division had lost 25 men killed, 88 men wounded, and 6 missing on this day. The 295th also suffered 123 casualties as well, which shows that the Soviets definitely weren't just retreating into Stalingrad at this stage. Worse, because of Zhukov's Kotlebane offensive, Wietersheim had requested support, and despite Paulus insisting that the assault on Stalingrad was the priority, Paulus decided to halt Seilitz's advance at midday on the 5th in order to divert Seilitz's air support to the north. There's 2 things to note here. First, it's interesting how the Germans decided not to advance without air support, suggesting that air support was a vital element of their ability to attack. And the second thing is that Zhukov's attack was having an effect. It was helping to save the city, even if it was failing tactically. It's a bit early to make a judgment about it, but going forward, we really need to keep these questions in the back of our minds. To what extent did Zhukov's attacks delay or prevent the Germans from taking Stalingrad, and was it worth the cost? Slightly further south, heavy enemy artillery fire rained down on both 14th and 24th Panzer Divisions, with 24th Panzer Division remaining on the defensive until the other divisions caught up to them. 29th Motorised Division and 14th Panzer Division attacked early in the morning, but were also stalled after taking a small amount of territory. In fact, 29th Motorised Division's attack went in without panzer support because so few tanks were left in working condition. This meant that the Soviet artillery and dug-in tanks were able to halt the German infantry assaults. 94th Infantry Division did push the 29th Rifle Division and the 154th Naval Rifle Brigade out of the village of Elki, but a counterattack was organised by 64th Army with several units, and they managed to stabilise the situation. Then German reconnaissance planes spotted 20 Soviet tanks near the village of Elki, and it was obvious that Soviet reinforcements were moving into the area. Elki, though, had been captured and remained in German hands for the next 3 months, despite becoming the new front line. The Romanian 1st and 2nd Divisions also launched an attack, taking some ground from 15th Guards Rifle Division and managed to straighten out their line. It was obvious, though, that the attack on Stalingrad had stalled, which is interesting because 4th Panzer Army's advance hadn't been stopped by Zhukov's attack, but because they were exhausted and were facing tough Soviet opposition. In order to get the offensive going again, Kempf proposed that the 20th Romanian Division should relieve the 29th Motorized and 14th Panzer Divisions, which would then allow them to concentrate all their strength with the 24th Panzer Division and advance. Hott agreed, and the Romanians began to take over the line that evening. To the west, the Romanian 5th Army Corps also began to take over German positions on the Don flank, with the rest of the Romanian 3rd Army relieving some of the Italian units to their west as well. This process wouldn't be complete for quite a while, as the troops were still marching up from the Caucasus. The sources are also vague on how it progressed, and this part of the front was quite quiet for some time, so we're not going to be looking at this area in any detail for a while. But this process would eventually allow some of the German units to be relieved and committed to the Battle of Stalingrad. So just bear in mind that this was happening in the background as we go through the next few episodes. On the other side of the line, there's evidence that the Soviets now believed that the city would fall. As a precaution, Lopatin ordered 5 tankless tank brigades into reserve positions along the eastern bank of the Volga outside Stalingrad. Shumilov also moved the 10th Reserve Rifle Brigade to the Bikitovka area, and Chuikov went to the village of Peshanka in an attempt to organise the defences in the area. We did not notice the approach of a number of German Ju-88s from the south. They spotted our vehicles and came in to attack us. Chuikov and his officers jumped into a dugout just in time as the Stukas pounced. Peshanka was bombed for about 10 minutes, and half of Chuikov's dugout was missing at the end of it, yet somehow they had all survived unscathed. Later, on his way back to the 64th Army's headquarters, Chuikov's convoy was attacked by yet another Stuka, but 2 machine gunners on a lorry fired at it. Not more than 100 yards from the machine gunners, the plane buried itself in the ground. Seriously, this Chuikov guy is like a Stuka magnet. Now, some of you suggested that I start a Chuikov almost died counter. Okay then, including these 2 attacks, so far in this series, Chuikov has almost died 8 times, and the Battle of Stalingrad City hasn't even begun yet. So, place your bets. How many times will Chuikov almost die? Let me know in the comments below. It's good though that Chuikov survived, because it was at this time that Lopatin received news that Zhukov's attacks to the north had resulted in failure. There was now little chance of them breaking through to where 23rd Tank Corps was. Since the 23rd Tank Corps and the 399th Rifle Division were in exposed positions, Lopatin decided to pull them back. In reality, 23rd Tank Corps consisted of just 1 brigade at this point, the 189th Tank Brigade, and pulling them both back would straighten out his line in the Konaya Station area. Therefore, overnight on the 5th to 6th of September, Lopatin ordered them to withdraw, and off came his head. Because even though he had slightly withdrawn his units, later on the 6th, Lopatin seems to have changed his mind. He was now demanding that they hold their ground regardless of the cost. And the reason for this about-face seems to be because Lopatin's order to withdraw greatly upset Yeremenko. In carrying out a decision by the Stavka of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, an order was issued by me, not a step back, which was violated by General Lopatin. We'll be coming back to discuss this incident when we move on to the next day, but possibly because of this move, and even though the attack on Stalingrad was Paulus's priority, Koloman now sent 92nd Grenadier Regiment and part of the 120th Grenadier Regiment to the north to reinforce the 8th Grenadier Regiment of 3rd Motorized Division. This obviously weakened the 14th Panzer Corps' southern forces, meaning that they wouldn't be able to assist, and thus would weaken Paulus's attack towards Stalingrad. In fact, only 2 Panzer Grenadier battalions were left in the south, and the rest were in the north. This tells us 2 things. Zhukov's first Kotlebane offensive was having an effect, since 14th Panzer Corps could now not advance into Stalingrad. and the withdrawal of the 23rd Tank Corps may have allowed the Germans to rush forces north to block Zhukov's advance. It's hard to tell if this was the case or not because the books are a bit vague, but this appears to be what happened. What can be confirmed is that the pressure exerted upon them by the 389th Infantry Division and a camp group from 3rd Motorized Division caused the Soviet line in the Orlovka region to collapse back to the area 5 kilometers northwest of Gorodichi, and that the German and Romanian advance towards Bigitovka was blocked this day by the Soviets. Enemy probes against the square forest were thrown back several times throughout the day. 24th Panzer Division was also suffering from ammunition shortages, which was partly why the Axis went nowhere in the south, plus the fact that Hoth's forces were currently reorganising. The next attack would be delayed until the 8th to allow time to gather supplies and prepare. And in the previous evening, Kempf had started working on a plan with his subordinates, and he had realised that since it was clear that his 3 divisions weren't strong enough individually to pierce the Soviet lines, it made sense to place every available panzer in the corps into one battle group, or Kampfgruppe. The good news was that this would concentrate their forces in one strong spear point. The bad news was that this would probably cause arguments between Hauenschelt and Heim. Generals don't really like their forces being placed in another general's hands, especially because a general cares less about someone else's troops. What tends to happen when units are mixed together like this is that the general in charge leans heavily on the troops that aren't his own, leading to higher losses. So it was decided that neither general would lead this combined arms group. Instead, all the panzers of the corps would be concentrated in Kampfgruppe Lanken, who was the commander of the 24th Panzer Regiment from the 24th Panzer Division. But this would then be assigned to Major Lankiet, commander of 36th Panzer Regiment from 14th Panzer Division, now reduced to a size of a battalion, to control operationally. That way, neither general had an exclusive monopoly of control over the units, and there would be a smaller chance of abusing the troops of either division. This compromise not only satisfied both generals, but it would allow the corps to actually get moving again. With the details worked out, a conference took place where Kempf presented his plan to Hoth, Fiebig, Heim, Hauenschelt and Fremery. The assault wouldn't start until the 8th of September because it would take time to reorganise the units and bring up the necessary supplies. And this delay would be necessary because the current ammunition shortages were significant, as this report from 24th Panzer Division indicates. Anxious about ammunition, particularly smoke and heavy field howitzer, also light field howitzer. Light field howitzers still 26% availability, smoke shells entirely absent. Heavy field howitzers still 40%. So they required time to bring up supplies, but in a nutshell, the plan was for the 48th Panzer Corps to attack into the southern part of Stalingrad and then move northeast through it. Such an advance would cut the remaining land connection to the outside world and force the city to live off whatever could be shipped across the Volga. Potentially this thrust could collapse the city's defences, but given the sorry state of German and Romanian divisions at this time, it was also likely that this could result in another failure. Things could go either way, especially because the Soviets had time to prepare to meet this attack. Zhukov records that on the 3rd and 4th days of his offensive, his attacks mainly consisted of just artillery and air battles. Probably because he didn't want to admit to his readers that his infantry and tanks were getting pummeled in reckless assaults. He also requests additional units to throw into the meat grinder, but they don't arrive on this day. Paulus, on the other hand, was satisfied that Wietersheim's corps had stabilised the situation in the north. So he resumed his advance towards Stalingrad on the 7th. Seydlitz's 51st Army Corps moved out at dawn, supported by 30 Stugs and groups of Stuka dive bombers. They gnawed their way forwards, with several Soviet units ahead of them forced to give ground. By the end of the day, the 399th Rifle Division had just 195 men left. The 112th had about 300, and the 87th had around 180. The 27th and 99th Tank Brigades were now almost tankless as well, and they were leaderless, with Major P. Popov wounded and Zhitnev killed in action this day. Yeremenko therefore ordered Kravchenko's remaining tanks to be handed over to Popov's 23rd Tank Corps, and withdrew the men of 2nd Tank Corps back across the Volga. Notice that Yeremenko was allowed to withdraw units across the Volga, but Lopatin wasn't. Kempt's forces continued to regroup, although small actions did take place in the south. Soviet reconnaissance units probed 24th Panzer Division's positions in the Square Forest, but were repulsed. However, heavy artillery, mortar, anti-tank and tank fire pounded the division all day. Soviet air strikes also took their toll, with General Kempf himself being lightly wounded as a result of one. After patching himself up, he visited 24th Panzer Division's headquarters to discuss the upcoming attack. The ammunition situation wasn't solved, but it had improved. Hauenschelt, though, was concerned that the upcoming attack would be difficult due to the constant artillery and rocket launcher bombardments, but Kempf dismissed his concerns. In preparation for this attack, 24th Panzer Division now split itself into 3 Kampfgruppen, commanded by Broik, Hellermann and Buer. Broik would command the division's assault force with 3 infantry battalions and most of the division's artillery and other elements. Hellermann would command the defence force with another 3 infantry battalions, the 635th Pioneer Battalion loaned from the 6th Army, and several other units. And Boer only had a mixed battalion-size force, but the plan was for Broik and parts of Kampfgruppe Hellermann to strike eastwards, aiming to take the road south of the leather factory. They would act as the northern force for the rest of the 48th Panzer Corps. In the centre, all of 48th Panzer Corps' panzers were concentrated under 14th Panzer Division and placed under Lankeit's control. Kampfgruppe Lanken was in the north, and Lankeit's 36th Panzer Regiment, now the size of a battalion but reinforced by the 129th Panzer Battalion from 29th Motorised Division, was to the south. It's not clear how many panzers were left in the 36th Panzer Regiment, but Petsch's 129th Panzer Battalion only had 15 panzers left. 7 of them were Panzer IIs, and even including the 3 Marders that accompanied them as well, they only had a total of 18 armoured fighting vehicles, which clearly wasn't good. 24th Panzer Regiment had 47 operational panzers at the moment, although 14 of them were Panzer IIs. So really, 2 panzer divisions and 1 motorised division had less tanks than 1 normal panzer division. This depleted force had the task of reaching the Volga Bridge that was 3 kilometers south of Yelshanka, and this was going to be a tall order given the state of the units. It should be clear that, even though they still hadn't reached the city itself, German forces were sapped of strength. And it wasn't just in terms of manpower and equipment either, they were also struggling to keep themselves supplied with ammunition. This leads us to question whether, if they had been at full strength, they could have supplied themselves in the field or not. It seems doubtful whether they actually could, and we have to ask ourselves to what extent are the losses in terms of equipment, at least, due to the fact that their logistics couldn't keep up. In his book on the 24th Panzer Division, Jason D. Mark does note that the Germans were struggling to keep their tanks in operation due to the lack of lubricants, as well as other spare parts, not just because the enemy were taking them out. The Dusty Steppe was breaking their tanks, and they lacked the means to prevent this, and it's obvious that their logistics were strained. They were making the best of a bad situation, but it seems that doubts were beginning to arise in the minds of the commanders. General Seydlitz and his chief of staff went to visit Paulus at 6th Army headquarters on the evening of the 7th of September. There they found Paulus seriously concerned. Zhukov's offensive in the Kotlebane region was straining 14th Panzer Corps in the north, and Hoth's 4th Panzer Army had stalled in its tracks. In addition to the manpower and equipment shortage, the logistical issues, and the problem of the Long Don flank, Paulus faced a dilemma. His main goal was to take the city of Stalingrad, but Zhukov's attack was giving him a headache. So, he could either ignore it and continue the attack on the city, or assist Wittersheim's beleaguered forces in the north. This was not an easy choice, and he didn't have enough forces to do both things at the same time. And despite the fact that German forces had done more or less nothing on this day, Halder noted in his diary, "Good progress at Stalingrad." What? Where? Right? This guy hasn't got a clue. And this indicates that there was a major communication issue between what was happening on the ground and what the guys at the top of the hierarchy thought was happening. And we're only talking a couple of layers here. Paulus seems to have realised that he was in trouble, but his commander, von Weichs, seems to be out of touch with reality, and his commander above him, Halder, even more so. This realisation should help to explain what happened in the German High Command on this day. Unsatisfied with the slow progress of Army Group A, Hitler sent Jodl to visit Field Marshal List to spur him on to speedier conquests. German forces had become stuck in the mountain passes, and except for Mayerkop, the vital oil fields were still not in Axis hands. When Jodl returned on the evening of the 7th, he reported to Hitler that the conditions at the front were very bad. He said that the Soviets were in the mountain passes and that List didn't have enough forces or strength to break through them. He explained and agreed with List's view that they may still have been able to reach Grozny if they ended all the other attacks, resupplied the entire army group, and concentrated all their forces for that one effort. Hitler exploded in a fit of rage unlike anything he had done before. He accused the army leadership of having a lack of initiative. Then, for the first time, he verbally insulted the messenger, the fateful Jodl, for bringing him the bad news and for supposedly siding with the army group over him. He screamed at Jodl, refusing to accept that List didn't have enough troops for the task. He had not sent him to the Caucasus, he said, to have him bring back doubts among the troops. Jodl then lost his nerve and shouted back, saying that List was only following the Führer's orders and that it had been Hitler's directive that had resulted in the failure of the campaign. "That is a lie!" screamed Hitler. His face blotched and his eyes feverish, the Führer stormed out of the meeting. This was a big deal because normally Hitler would shake hands with his generals when their meetings were over, but not anymore. As Keitel says, "It was not until the 30th of January 1943 that he deigned to shake hands with Jodl and myself again." And because Jodl had said that it had been Hitler's orders that had got him into this mess, and because Hitler refused to accept this, he said that his generals had twisted his words. Within 48 hours, a group of shorthand typists, practice stenographers from the Reichstag, where the need for active stenographers was by now hardly pressing, arrived at Führer HQ. Hitler had insisted upon a record of all military briefings being taken so that he could not again be misinterpreted. And despite the stifling summer heat, an icy atmosphere now descended over the Führer's headquarters. Certainly in terms of Hitler's relationship with his generals, this was a turning point. He withdrew into the confines of his own hut and didn't come out, forcing the staff of the Wehrmacht to conduct military briefings in there with him and not in the main headquarters. Only a few were allowed in at a time. He also refused to eat meals with the others, as he had done before, and his only companion now was his dog, Blondie. His eyes were described as a long stare of burning hate, and the mood became depressed amongst the officers and all visitors. Reporting the incident on the next day, Halder wrote, "Lack of progress in Army Group A is a bitter disappointment for the Führer. Cutting reproaches the Army Group Command and the generals as a whole. Jodl, on the return from his visit to List, proposes not only not to advance Mountain Corps any further, but, on the contrary, to take it back. The effect is annoyance of the highest degree." The Faulblau campaign wasn't over, but the advance had stalled, and the failure to reach the Caucasus oil fields or knock the Soviet Union out of the war was telling upon Hitler's nerves. As Hitler had previously stated, "If I do not get the oil of Mayakop and Grozny, then I must end this war." Well, he had gotten to Mayakop, but not to Grozny, and the advance had now stalled. He also hadn't got any oil from Mayakop yet, and wouldn't do so for some time. So it was obvious to him now that his final gamble was failing, if it hadn't already failed. And by his own words, this effectively meant that he had lost the war. But it seems that he could not accept this, which is why he snapped. Now, it's worth offering a counterbalance to the usual narrative surrounding this event, because we only really have the perspective of the generals, who later were trying to save their own necks and pretend that Madman Hitler was to blame for their own mistakes. The thing is, though, that while Keitel and Halder and others blame Hitler for everything that went wrong, and Hitler certainly made some big mistakes, he wasn't the only one to blame for this disaster. Halder had just written "Good progress at Stalingrad," which is complete and utter fantasy. The troops were running out of ammunition, and Jodl had been sent to speak to List to spur him on, which is a nice idea in theory, but in reality, List didn't really need encouragement to move forward. List hadn't slowed or stopped because he had no motivation, he had stopped because his forces were at their absolute limits. Jodl had clearly not realised this before going to see List, otherwise he could have just told Hitler beforehand and thus not wasted his time. But instead he went to List, discovered what the situation was for the first time, became convinced by the reality at the front, and then went back to deliver this news to Hitler. Well, this, and other reasons as well, clearly indicate that both Hitler and his generals in the high command were out of touch with what was going on at the front, yet were still trying to put a good face on it. Was this a communications issue, a leadership issue, or just a blind arrogance that they were so superior that they had nothing to worry about and could just safely ignore all their problems? At the end of the day, Hitler didn't act alone. He took advice from his generals and gave orders to them, and they also made their own decisions. Halder and the others had planned the Faulblau campaign, and it was failing. So, is it reasonable for Hitler to be mad at them? Arguably so, which is why Halder would once again find himself in trouble with the Führer. I'll let you decide whether Hitler was right to be mad at his generals or not, but either way, it does seem that Hitler had realised that the turning point of the war had been reached, which is why his mood had darkened. He sank into a depressive state because he knew that the game was up. So, does this mean the turning point of the Faulblau campaign had been reached? If so, this was before the Germans got to the city of Stalingrad, in which case, did the turning point of the Battle of Stalingrad happen the week before the Battle of Stalingrad itself actually started? That's certainly something to ponder. So I'll leave you to it. Thanks for watching, bye for now.